Shalom, shalom. This is Kadar, Nation of Kings and Priests, coming with a quick class concerning the Arabic-Arabian Ishmael slave trade. Right, because a lot of our people don't know that not only did we go into slavery through the transatlantic slave trade, but we also went through what they call the Silk Road slave trade, or the Sahara slave trade. So this is another slavery that happened before the transatlantic slave trade through unknown popular belief. A lot of people don't know about this, that we went into slavery through the Sahara slave trade, and it was the first and oldest slave trade. So I'm going in to show my people what happened during that time period. First and foremost, I'm going to say, Call Allah, Yahweh, King Yahwahshi HaMashiac. Let's give all honor and glory to the Most High through His only begotten Son, putting the Spirit on me to come with this quick class. First precept I want to dive into is the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 1, verse 1. And it reads, "These be the words which Moses spake unto all Israel on this side Jordan, in the wilderness, in the plain over against the Red Sea." So, anything that's coming out in Deuteronomy is concerning the children of Israel. These are the things that's going to befall them in the last days. So I'm going to go to Deuteronomy Slakia, bear with me. 28 verse 15. "But it shall come to pass, if thou wilt not hearken unto the voice of the Lord your God, to observe to do all his commandments and his statutes, which I command thee this day, that all these curses shall come upon thee and overtake thee." And the Lord goes on to explain the curses that's going to befall us. That we're going into captivity and different things of that sort. I want to jump down to 28 and 20. "The Lord shall send upon thee cursing, vexation, and rebuke, and all that thou settest thine hand unto for to do, until thou be destroyed, and until thou perish quickly, because of the wickedness of thy doings, whereby thou hast forsaken me." So this is what's going to happen to us. We're going to be rebuked, have cursing and vexation on us from the Almighty, because we broke his laws. We disobeyed him. We broke the Lord's commandment. Jumping to 25. "The Lord shall cause thee to be smitten before thy enemies. Thou shalt go out one way against them, and flee 7 ways before them, and shalt be removed into all the kingdoms of the earth." And that's what happened to us. We have been separated and split up into multiple different kingdoms that's ruled by these heathens. This is what I'm about to show you with this video that we're about to dive into. Just to give y'all an example, this is what the Most High ordained that was going to happen to the children of Israel. Alright, let's dive in.
In 1842 CE, the British Consul General in Morocco wrote a letter to the Sultan to ask him if he had taken any measures to stop slavery, or at least slave trade. The Sultan replied that he did not do anything about it, because it had been the norm since the time of the sons of Adam, and no sects of Islam are against it. Hence, he will not permit anything that the Quran forbids, and will not make anything unlawful that the Quran has allowed. In the Sultan's reply, we see the simplest justification, or at least excuse, for almost 1300 years of slavery in the Islamic world. This video is part of a bigger collaboration between various YouTube history channels on the topic of Africa. Don't forget to watch the video before this one by Stefan Milo on the Swahili culture. First of all, I've chosen to call this trade the Arab slave trade because Arabs were a key part of this network. Arabs weren't the only people involved in this trade, but still, most of the rulers and raiders involved in the process were Arabs. Most of the important markets were in Arab cities as well. I didn't call it the East African slave trade because it wasn't just done through East Africa. Other trade routes were involved as well. Slavery was already practiced in Arabia and most of the areas that the Muslims conquered in the 7th and 8th centuries. Islam did not abolish slavery, but some regulations were set which were increased upon by the caliphs. There were 4 ways someone could end up a slave. First, a child born to slave parents was a slave. Secondly, someone captured in a jihad against non-Muslims could be made a slave. Third, a slave could be purchased. Or finally, a slave could be given as a tribute. The people living under Islamic rule, Muslim or non-Muslim, could not be enslaved unless they rebelled or they helped an enemy of the state. Bernard Lewis writes, slaves were excluded from religious functions or from any office involving jurisdiction over others. Their testimony was not admitted at judicial proceedings. In penal law, the penalty for an offense against a person, a fine or bloodwit was, for a slave, half of that for a free man. While maltreatment was deplored, there was no fixed penalty. In what might be called civil matters, the slave was a chattel with no legal powers or rights whatsoever. He could not enter into a contract, hold property, or inherit. If he incurred a fine, his owner was responsible. He was, however, distinctly better off in the matter of rights compared to a Greek or a Roman slave. Since Islamic jurists, and not only philosophers and moralists, took down accounts of humanitarian considerations, they laid down, for example, that a master must give his slave medical attention when required, must give him adequate upkeep, and must support him in his old age. If a master defaulted on these and other obligations to his slave, the Qadi could compel him to fulfill them, or else either to sell or emancipate the slave. The master was forbidden to overwork his slave, and if he did so to the point of cruelty, he was liable to a penalty which was, however, discretionary and not prescribed by law. A slave could enter into a contract to earn his freedom, in which case his master had no obligation to pay for his upkeep. While in theory the slave could not own property, he could be granted certain rights of ownership, for example, for which he paid a fixed sum to his master. In the Islamic world, various ethnicities were enslaved, not just people of African descent. In fact, they were all considered to have their own advantages. Ibn Batlan, in his handbook, tries to characterize them. He recommends Indians and Nubians as guards of persons or property, as laborers, servants, and eunuchs he recommends Zanj, and as slaves, Turks and Slavs. Yes, even white people could be enslaved. However, there was a distinction between them. The white slaves were called mamluk, or owned, and the black slaves were called abd, which means slave. Where white slaves could rise up to respectable positions, the black slaves could not. The Mamluks had their own dynasties in Egypt and India, but the abd slaves never did. In fact, even in literature or poetry, we hardly find an example of a black man, slave or otherwise, after the Umayyads.
You see that? Our people was still treated like trash. That's the same thing like what they did during the transatlantic slave trade. When their people came over here, their people was the indigenous, I'm confused on the word. Endangered slave, they had better privileges than us. They was still getting paid. They was still had things that was happening to them that they wasn't going through as much as our people. Babies wasn't getting dashed to stone or gator bait. They wasn't being hung at a picnic called pick a nigga. They wasn't dealing with all that. It's the same thing during the Sahara slave trade. They were treated like gods. Kings could get their own land while our people couldn't get that. This is the book of Deuteronomy chapter 28 verse 29. And thou shalt grope at noonday, as the blind gropeth in darkness. And thou shalt not prosper in thy ways. And thou shalt be only oppressed and spoiled evermore. And no man shall save thee. This is what's going on. We are not going to be saved. We're going to continue to be tormented. As long as we stay under the rules of these other nations, this is what's going to happen to us. We're going to be destroyed and spoiled and eyes cut out and turned into eunuchs. This is what these people have in store for us.
Even free Muslim people weren't all treated fairly across the Muslim world, but as always, there were exceptions. An early chronicler, Jashiyari, writes an anecdote about a man called Abdulhamid, who was apparently the secretary of the last Umayyad Caliph. The story goes that the Caliph had received a gift of a black slave from a provincial governor. The Caliph was unhappy with him and told his secretary to write a letter of gratitude and disparagement. Abdulhamid wrote, "Had you been able to find a smaller number than one and a worse color than black, you would have sent that as a gift." This story, along with many others, show that Arabs didn't view African slaves particularly nicely and preferred other ethnicities if they could get them. Even in the times of Prophet Muhammad, Byzantine and Persian slaves were found in Arabia. Africans were just one of various slaves available. However, over time, the number of black slaves grew disproportionately. Main reason for that was the stabilization of the frontiers. Turks and Indians started to embrace Islam, and so not many of them could be enslaved. And as jihad slowed down after the 8th century, so did the number of non-white slaves. Mostly against Byzantine and other European states, captured prisoners were ransomed or exchanged. While it's easy to say that the distinguishing factor between slaves and non-slaves was religion and not race, that's not all that true. The ruler of Bornu, for example, complained in a letter to the Sultan in Egypt about how the slave trades were ravaging Bornu and enslaving free men, even members of the ruler's family and Muslims. While it was forbidden to enslave Muslims, in practice, if you were a black Muslim, you could be enslaved. Very early on, the Muslims signed a treaty with Nubia, where Nubia would provide slaves in exchange for peace. This was probably the reason that Nubia was not taken over by the Muslims for quite a while. However, conquests across the Sahara opened trade routes across the African continent. And among the things transported across the routes were religion, ideas, and unfortunately, slaves. Muslim Arabs bought slaves from these routes.
You see that? Even our own people, they try to convert to their religion and still was treated like trash. Even though they wanted to be like them, they still went into slavery. They still were tormented. They still was butchered. This is the book of 1 Maccabees, chapter 1, verse 11. In those days went there out of Israel wicked men, who persuaded many, saying, "Let us go and make a covenant with the heathen that are around about us. For since we departed from them, we have much sorrow." These idiots think if we go and be like the heathens, guess what? We're going to be blessed and they're going to take care of us and show us love. No, they still gave you the sword. They still gave you the whip. They still gave you the shackles. And you still wanted to be like them. This is the book of Proverbs, chapter 3, verse 31. Envy thou not the oppressor, and choose none of his ways. You can't be like him. He doesn't care about you. He don't care about you. He just wanted to destroy you. And you're okay with it. Let's continue.
All across northern Africa and brought them back into the Islamic heartland. This started almost right after the conquests and the subsequent stabilization of the frontiers. The coast of the Zanj, modern Kenya and Tanzania, was used by the Arabs to bring slaves to Yemen, and from there Oman and the Persian Gulf, and cities like Basra and Baghdad is where they were sold to the Muslims. Somalis, before they were Islamized, were a large number of slaves imported, and